100 years ago, snacks didn't come in shiny wrappers. They came wrapped in memory, survival, and simplicity. Before vending machines, before ultra-processed convenience foods, people reached for snacks that told a story. Foods born from scarcity, tradition, and ingenuity. Some were sweet comforts during hard times. Others were strange by today's standards, and a few might even shock you. As you watch, ask yourself, backhand index pointing right, which of these would you still eat today? Backhand index pointing right, and which one should stay in the past? Because these weren't just snacks, they were a glimpse into everyday life 100 years ago. Number 1. Hardtack biscuits. It was said that hardtack didn't go stale because it was already stale when it was made. Hardtack biscuits were one of the most common snacks and survival food from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Made from just flour, water, and sometimes salt, these biscuits were baked repeatedly until every trace of moisture was gone. The goal wasn't flavor, it was endurance. Hardtack could last for years without spoiling, making it ideal for soldiers, sailors, factory workers, and families who couldn't afford waste. In homes without refrigeration, longevity mattered more than comfort. Hardtack was often stored in tins, sacks, or wooden boxes, waiting for the day it would be needed. Hardtack mattered because hunger didn't wait for fresh bread. When times were hard, or when people worked long hours far from home, this simple biscuit became a reliable source of calories. It traveled well, cost very little, and could be eaten at any time of day. Many dipped it into coffee, milk, or soup just to soften it enough to bite. For some, hardtack was a daily snack. For others, it was a last resort, but it was always there. What shocked many was just how hard it truly was. Stories tell of broken teeth, chipped knives, and biscuits so tough they could be used as makeshift tools. Worse still, hardtack often carried unwanted protein, insects that had made themselves at home inside the biscuit. Yet even then, people brushed them off and ate anyway. Hunger had a way of lowering standards. And when hardtack became too dull, too dry, or simply unbearable, people reached for something sweeter, something sticky and comforting, leading us straight to molasses candy. Number 2. Molasses candy. Before chocolate bars lined store shelves, sweetness came from a bubbling pot of molasses on the stove. Around 100 years ago, molasses was one of the most affordable sweeteners available, especially for working-class and rural families. Refined sugar was expensive, but molasses, a thick, dark byproduct of sugar refining, was accessible and versatile. Families used it for baking, cooking, and when treats were scarce, for candy. Molasses candy was often made at home by boiling molasses with a bit of vinegar or butter, then pouring it onto cold surfaces to cool. Molasses candy mattered because it turned hardship into comfort. It was cheap, filling, and sweet enough to feel like a luxury. Children gathered around kitchen tables, pulling the candy by hand as it cooled, stretching it until it turned lighter in color. This wasn't just a snack. It was an event, especially during long winters when morale needed lifting. What surprises many today is how labor-intensive this treat was. Burned fingers, sticky counters, and aching arms were common. Yet the memory of making molasses candy often outshines the struggle. For many, the smell alone still brings back childhood kitchens filled with warmth, even when cupboards were nearly bare. And when the craving for sweetness gave way to the need for warmth, people turned to a snack that filled both hands and hearts: roasted chestnuts. Number 3. Roasted chestnuts. The crackle of chestnuts roasting once echoed through streets long before packaged snacks existed. Roasted chestnuts were a popular snack across Europe and America in the early 20th century. Sold by street vendors or prepared at home, chestnuts were abundant, affordable, and easy to cook. During colder months, they became a seasonal staple, especially in cities where vendors roasted them over open flames and sold them in paper cones. Chestnuts were filling, nutritious, and warming, exactly what people needed during harsh winters. They required no fancy preparation and were often eaten while walking or working. For many families, chestnuts blurred the line between snack and meal, offering comfort when times were uncertain. What's striking today is how this once common snack has nearly vanished from daily life. Chestnut vendors were once as familiar as coffee carts are now. The disappearance of roasted chestnuts isn't just about taste. It marks a shift away from seasonal, local food traditions that once defined everyday living. But warmth didn't always come from fire. Sometimes it came from fat, salt, and necessity, like the pork scraps people refused to waste. Number 4. Salted pork fat scraps. Nothing was wasted, especially not fat. In households 100 years ago, especially farming and working-class homes, pork was a prized resource. After slaughtering a pig, every part was used. Fat scraps were salted and stored, later eaten as snacks or added to meals. These scraps provided calories and energy when fresh food wasn't available. Salted pork fat was dense, filling, and long-lasting. A small piece could curb hunger during long workdays. For laborers, this wasn't indulgence, it was fuel. Fat meant strength, endurance, and survival in an era of physically demanding lives. By today's standards, eating plain fat may sound unthinkable. But for many families, it was the difference between hunger and stability. What feels shocking now was once normal, and even comforting, proof of how survival reshapes taste. And when even meat scraps ran low, people turned to the simplest combination of all, bread and whatever dripped from the pan. Number 5. Bread with dripping. Sometimes, a snack was nothing more than bread and yesterday's leftovers. Bread with dripping, meat fat collected from roasting or frying, was common in early 20th century households. Instead of throwing fat away, families saved it and spread it over bread. This practice was widespread in both Europe and America, especially during economic hardship. This snack was quick, warm, and deeply satisfying. Bread absorbed the fat, making it rich and filling. For children and adults alike, it was a familiar taste of home, often eaten after long days of work or school. What's emotional is how many people remember this snack with affection. Despite its simplicity and poverty-associated origins, it symbolized care, resourcefulness, and a household doing its best with what it had. And when preservation mattered more than freshness, people relied on jars and vinegar, leading us to the unmistakable smell of pickled eggs. Number 6. Pickled eggs. They sat quietly in glass jars, floating in vinegar, waiting for someone brave enough to take a bite. Pickled eggs became popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in taverns, general stores, and homes without refrigeration. Eggs were hard-boiled and preserved in vinegar, often tinted pink by beet juice. This method allowed families and shopkeepers to extend the life of protein-rich food for weeks or even months. Pickled eggs mattered because they were practical. They were cheap, filling, and didn't require cooking when hunger struck. For working men, they were a bar snack. For families, they were an easy addition to meals or a quick bite between chores. What shocks people today is the smell, sharp, sour, and unmistakable. Yet for those who grew up with them, that scent meant food security. The jar on the counter was reassurance that something nourishing was always within reach. But when preservation wasn't enough, people looked to nature itself, drying fruit to capture sweetness that could last all year. Number 7. Dried apple rings. Apples didn't disappear when the harvest ended. They simply changed form. Before refrigeration, families preserved apples by slicing and drying them. Rings were threaded on a string or spread near stoves and windows. Dried apple rings became common pantry snacks throughout the early 1900s, especially in rural households. Dried apples offered sweetness, fiber, and a taste of summer during long winters. They required no sugar, no packaging, and no waste. Children grabbed them by the handful, and adults carried them into fields or factories. What feels surprising now is how patient the process was. Days of drying for a snack that disappeared in minutes. Yet every bite carried the memory of orchards, family kitchens, and seasons that moved slower than today. And when fruit gave way to something heartier, people turned to legumes, softened not by roasting, but by time and boiling. Number 8. Boiled peanuts. They weren't crunchy. They were soft, salty, and strangely comforting. Boiled peanuts were a common snack in rural America, especially in the South, well over a century ago. Raw peanuts were boiled for hours in salted water until tender. This method required little equipment and transformed hard peanuts into a filling, warm snack. Boiled peanuts were affordable and filling. They could be cooked in large batches and eaten over several days. For farming families, they were easy to prepare and perfect for sharing during long conversations or breaks from work. Today, many people find the texture surprising, even unsettling. But for those who grew up with them, boiled peanuts were not at all. They were tied to front porches, slow afternoons, and the rhythm of rural life. And when peanuts weren't enough, corn took center stage, ground, shaped, and fried into something simple and satisfying. Number 9. Corn Dodgers. Small, golden, and humble. Corn Dodgers filled stomachs when little else could. Corn Dodgers were small fried cornmeal dumplings popular in the American South and Midwest. Made from cornmeal, water, or milk, and sometimes fat, they were fried quickly and eaten hot. By the early 1900s, they were a common snack and side dish. Corn was cheap and widely available. Corn Dodgers turned basic ingredients into something warm and filling. They traveled well and could be eaten by hand, making them ideal for workers and children alike. What stands out now is their simplicity. No seasoning, no garnish, just corn and heat. Yet for many families, that simplicity represented stability in uncertain times. And when even frying wasn't possible, people turned to the most basic comfort of all, a slice of bread and a sprinkle of sweetness. Number 10. Sugar on bread. For many children, this was dessert. Sugar on bread became popular during times of economic hardship in the early 20th century. When candy and pastries were too expensive, families sprinkled sugar, sometimes with butter, on a plain bread to create a quick treat. This snack was cheap, fast, and joyful. It gave children something sweet to look forward to, even when resources were scarce. It was a small indulgence that felt like generosity. What's emotional is how often this snack is remembered with love. Despite its simplicity, it represented care, parents finding a way to make childhood feel normal during difficult times. And when sweetness came not from sugar, but from something darker and richer, molasses returned, this time poured generously over biscuits. Number 11. Molasses on biscuits. Before frosting and jam, biscuits met their sweetness in thick, dark molasses. In the early 1900s, biscuits were a staple food across many households, especially in the American South and rural communities. Molasses, being cheaper and more available than refined sugar, became the natural pairing. Warm biscuits were split open and drizzled generously with molasses, often eaten for breakfast or as a snack between meals. This combination was affordable, filling, and deeply satisfying. Molasses added calories and minerals, while biscuits provided comfort and familiarity. For many families, this snack bridged the gap between hunger and sustenance, especially during lean seasons. What's surprising today is how strongly this flavor combination lingers in memory. For those who grew up with it, the taste of molasses on biscuits still evokes kitchens warmed by wood stoves and mornings that began before sunrise. But biscuits weren't the only source of protein. Across the world, people turned to humble legumes, roasted until crisp. Number 12. Roasted chickpeas. Long before packaged chips, chickpeas crackled in ovens and pans. Roasted chickpeas have been eaten for centuries across the Middle East, Mediterranean, and South Asia. By the early 20th century, they were a common street snack and household food, especially in regions where meat was scarce or expensive. Chickpeas were dried, roasted, and lightly salted to create a crunchy, portable snack. They were nutritious, affordable, and long-lasting. Roasted chickpeas provided protein and energy without spoilage, making them ideal for workers, travelers, and children. They could be eaten slowly, shared easily, and prepared in large quantities. What surprises many is how modern this snack feels. While today it's marketed as a healthy alternative, 100 years ago it was simply necessity, proof that some old foods never truly disappear. And when crunch gave way to chew, families paired hard bread with something sharp and sustaining. Number 13. Cheese with hard. A wedge of cheese and a slab of bread could carry a person through an entire day. Before soft, sliced loaves became common, bread was dense and often baked to last. Paired with aged cheese, this combination was a go-to snack for laborers in the early 1900s. Cheese aged well and offered valuable protein and fat, especially where refrigeration was limited. This pairing was efficient and nourishing. It required no cooking and could be eaten anywhere: fields, factories, or schoolyards. For many, it was less a snack and more a lifeline between meals. What feels shocking now is how little was needed to feel satisfied. Today's abundance has shifted expectations, but this simple pairing once represented security and strength. And when bread ran low or dough was left behind, nothing went to waste, not even the scraps. Number 14. Fried dough scraps. Even leftovers had a second life. When bread or pastry dough was left over, families fried it instead of throwing away. Dough scraps were dropped in a hot fat, puffing up into irregular, golden bites. This practice was common in early 20th century homes where waste was unthinkable. Fried dough scraps were fast, warm, and satisfying. They required no extra ingredients and turned leftovers into something enjoyable. Children often gathered nearby, waiting for the first piece to cool. What's emotional is how joy came from so little. These scraps weren't planned treats. They were spontaneous moments of comfort in otherwise practical kitchens. And when snacking became less about hunger and more about passing time, people turned to seeds, slow to eat, but deeply satisfying. Number 15. Salted sunflower seeds. Some snacks weren't meant to be rushed. Sunflower seeds were a common snack in Eastern Europe, Asia, and parts of America by the early 1900s. They were roasted and salted, then eaten one by one, often while talking, watching, or working. They were inexpensive and filling, but more importantly, they occupied time. Eating sunflower seeds slowed moments down, offering comfort through repetition rather than indulgence. What surprises many is how unchanged this habit remains. 100 years later, people still crack shells the same way. Proof that some traditions outlast time itself. And when fat returned to the skillet, bread followed, this time sizzling, rich, and unforgettable. Number 16. Lard fried bread. When the pan was still warm, bread was never far behind. In early 20th century kitchens, lard was one of the most common cooking fats. After frying meat or vegetables, families reused the remaining lard to fry slices of bread. This practice was widespread in both rural and working-class homes where waste was not an option. Lard-fried bread was quick, filling, and comforting. The bread soaked up the fat, turning simple ingredients into something rich and satisfying. It could be eaten as a snack, a breakfast, or even a late-night bite after long hours of work. What feels shocking now is how normal this was. Today, frying bread in animal fat seems excessive, but 100 years ago, fat meant energy, and energy meant survival. And when sweetness came straight from nature, nothing was more prized than honey in its rawest form. Number 17. Honeycomb chunks. It dripped, stuck to fingers, and tasted like summer itself. Before honey was mass-filtered and bottled, people often ate it straight from the comb. Beekeeping was common in rural areas, and honeycomb was cut into chunks and eaten as is. Wax, honey, and all. Honeycomb was both snack and medicine. It provided quick energy, soothed sore throats, and required no preparation. Children especially loved the sweetness, while adults valued its natural purity. What surprises many today is that people chew the wax too, spitting it out afterward or swallowing small pieces. It was messy, imperfect, and entirely natural, a stark contrast to today's polished foods. But sweetness didn't last forever, especially near the sea, where protein came dried and strong-smelling. Number 18. Dried fish strips. The smell announced it long before the taste. In coastal regions and fishing communities, fish was often preserved by drying. Thin strips were salted and hung in the open air until fully cured. By the early 1900s, dried fish was a common snack for sailors, dock workers, and families living near water. Dried fish lasted for months and provided valuable protein. It could be eaten without cooking and carried easily. For many, it was the taste of home and the sea. What shocks modern tastes is the intensity, strong flavor, tough texture, and pungent smell. Yet for those who grew up with it, dried fish was comfort, not hardship. And when survival pushed people further, even trees became a source of food. Number 19. Roasted acorns. In desperate times, people looked upward to the trees. Acorns have been eaten for centuries, but by the early 1900s, they re-emerged during periods of extreme scarcity. Acorns had to be processed carefully, soaked and roasted to remove bitterness before eating. They were free, abundant, and available when crops failed. For struggling families, acorns meant survival. They could be eaten roasted or ground into meal. What's shocking today is the patience required. Preparing acorns took time and knowledge, proof of how far people were willing to go to feed themselves. And when sweetness returned, it came hardened, brittle, and meant to be shared. Number 20. Peanut brittle. It cracked loudly, sometimes louder than laughter. Peanut brittle was a popular homemade candy in the early 20th century. Made by caramelizing sugar and stirring in peanuts, it was poured flat and left to harden. Often prepared during holidays or special occasions. Peanut brittle was affordable and celebratory. It stretched small amounts of sugar and nuts into something that felt special. Families broke it into pieces and shared it around the table. What stands out now is how physical it was, sometimes requiring a hammer to break. Yet that act of breaking and sharing made it memorable, turning food into an experience. And when celebrations faded, people returned to the simplest street snack of all: corn, boiled and handed over warm. Number 21. Boiled corn on the cob. Sometimes the simplest food carried the strongest comfort. Boiled corn on the cob was a common street and home snack in the early 1900s. Vendors sold it warm from carts, while families boiled fresh ears during harvest season. It required no seasoning and little preparation, making it accessible to nearly everyone. Corn was filling, familiar, and inexpensive. It could be eaten by hand and shared easily. For many, it was both a snack and a small meal, satisfying hunger without ceremony. What's surprising is how little it needed. No butter, no salt, just corn and heat. Yet for those who remember it, the taste still carries echoes of summer evenings and simpler days. And when freshness needed to last longer, vinegar took over. Number 22. Pickled cucumbers. Crunchy, sour, and unmistakable. Pickles were never meant to be subtle. Pickled cucumbers were preserved in barrels and jars long before modern refrigeration. By the early 20th century, they were a common snack sold individually or kept at home. Vinegar allowed vegetables to last through seasons when gardens were bare. Pickles provided flavor when meals were otherwise bland. They stimulated appetite and added brightness to daily food. For many children, they were an exciting treat despite their sharp taste. What shocks some today is how strong and sour early pickles were. Yet that intensity is exactly what made them memorable. Bold flavor in an otherwise quiet diet. And when loaves were nearly gone, even the smallest pieces mattered. Number 23. Raisin bread ends. The end of the loaf was often the sweetest part. Raisin bread was a special purchase in the early 1900s. The ends of the loaf, thicker and often sweeter, were saved and eaten as snacks. Nothing was thrown away, especially something with raisins. These pieces felt like a reward. Children waited eagerly for them, and adults appreciated the extra flavor. It was a reminder that even scraps could feel special. What's emotional is how these small moments linger in memory. The end of the loaf wasn't just bread, it was anticipation and quiet joy. And when sugar was scarce, people made it stretch in unexpected ways. Number 24. Burnt sugar syrup. When sugar met heat, something new was born. Burnt sugar syrup was made by caramelizing sugar and adding water. It was used as a topping or eaten by itself when ingredients were limited. This practice became common during times of scarcity. It turned a single ingredient into something rich and complex. A spoonful could sweeten bread, porridge, or memories of a hard day. What surprises people today is how bitter it could be. Yet that bitterness mirrored the times, and still it was cherished. And finally, when nothing was fresh and nothing was warm, people ate what remained. Number 25. Cold, leftover porridge. It was eaten quietly, without complaint. Porridge was a staple food, and leftovers were never wasted. Once cooled, it firmed up and could be sliced or eaten cold by hand. This was common in early 20th century households. It was filling, nourishing, and already prepared. Cold porridge required no fire, making it practical and reliable. What feels shocking now is how normal this was. Cold porridge wasn't punishment. It was routine, a quiet acceptance of necessity. Smooth transition to outro. And through all these snacks, one thing becomes clear. Food was never just food. 100 years ago, snacks weren't designed for convenience or craving. They were shaped by survival, resourcefulness, and care. Every bite carried a story of families making do, of children finding joy in simplicity, and of traditions passed hand to hand. Some of these foods may feel strange today. Others might still feel familiar. But all of them remind us that history lives not only in books, but in kitchens, street corners, and quiet moments of hunger. If you enjoyed this journey through time, subscribe to the World Tapestry for more stories woven from memory, culture, and the everyday lives of the past. Because the past isn't gone. It's still on our plates,